The neighborhood was designed to look flawless. Every house followed the same color palette, every lawn trimmed to the same height, every mailbox aligned as if measured with a ruler. Even the sidewalks seemed to curve with intention, guiding residents toward a version of suburban perfection that promised peace,
That's my car!
order, and safety.
You can't do this!
For newcomers, it felt reassuring. For longtime residents, it felt suffocating. The Homeowners Association governed everything here. From the shade of exterior paint to the placement of trash bins, nothing escaped its oversight. Most residents accepted it as the cost of living somewhere nice. They paid their dues, skimmed the newsletters, and followed the rules without much thought. Problems only arose when someone decided the rules mattered more than the people living under them. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Life followed a steady routine. Workdays ended in quiet evenings. Weekends passed with the hum of lawnmowers and the distant laughter of families. Cars lined the street in neat rows, never lingering long enough to draw attention. It was the kind of environment where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. That illusion shattered early one morning when the curb outside one house sat empty. The car had been parked there the night before, exactly where it had always been parked. It wasn't blocking a driveway. It wasn't on a fire lane. It wasn't violating city law. The owner remembered checking the distance from the curb, the angle of the wheels, even the proximity to the nearest mailbox. Everything had been fine. Yet when the front door opened at dawn, the space was bare. At first, confusion replaced concern. There was a brief moment where the mind searched for logical explanations. Maybe it had been moved for street cleaning. Maybe there was a mistake. That moment didn't last long. A small laminated notice taped to the door provided the answer. The vehicle had been towed for improper parking under HOA regulations. No prior warning. No courtesy notice. Just a violation number and a phone number for the towing company. The shock wasn't just about the missing car. It was about how sudden it was. One moment everything was normal. The next, there was a fine, an inconvenience, and a sense that something invisible had turned hostile. The cost to retrieve the car was high. Towing fees, storage charges, administrative penalties. By the time the car was released, the total had climbed far beyond what seemed reasonable for a minor parking issue. Still, the owner paid it, assuming it was a misunderstanding that would be corrected once clarified. That assumption would prove wrong. Later that day, an official HOA notice arrived by email. It stated that the car had been parked at an incorrect angle, creating a potential safety hazard. The language was formal and final, leaving no room for appeal. The rule cited was vague, open to interpretation, and impossible to verify after the fact. What stood out most was the signature. The HOA president's name appeared at the bottom, accompanied by a title that carried more weight in this neighborhood than it should have. The HOA president had been in charge for years. She was known for her strict interpretation of rules and her visible presence around the neighborhood. She walked the streets regularly, clipboard in hand, scanning lawns, fences, and driveways. Some residents admired her dedication. Others avoided her entirely. She believed order was the highest virtue. To her, rules weren't guidelines. They were weapons for maintaining control. The first tow could still have been a coincidence. A single incident, harsh but isolated. The owner chose to move on, adjusting parking habits, double-checking every detail. The car was parked with obsessive care after that, measured and repositioned until it seemed impossible to find fault. It didn't matter. A second notice appeared days later, this time a warning. It claimed the vehicle was parked too close to a driveway. The driveway in question belonged to the same house, but the HOA didn't acknowledge that detail. The warning threatened towing if the issue continued. The owner felt the shift then. The subtle realization that this wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about scrutiny. From that point forward, every time the car was parked, it felt like an invitation for punishment. The curb no longer felt neutral. It felt watched. The owner began noticing the HOA president's slow walks past the house, the brief pauses, the way her eyes lingered on the car. The third tow confirmed it. This time, it happened in the middle of the night. No warning. No notice until morning. The explanation changed again. Now the car was allegedly parked too far from the curb, violating a different rule than before. The contradiction didn't matter to the HOA. Enforcement had become arbitrary. The financial strain grew quickly. Each tow drained savings. Each fine added stress. The inconvenience disrupted work, responsibilities, and daily life. But worse than the money was the feeling of being targeted. Others in the neighborhood began to notice. Quiet glances. Sympathetic nods. No one spoke openly. No one wanted to be next. The HOA president thrived in this environment. Her authority went unchallenged because fear kept people silent. She enforced rules selectively, focusing on those who didn't fit her ideal image of the neighborhood. The older car. The quieter homeowner. The person who didn't socialize at HOA events. To her, that made the owner an easy target. What she didn't know was that this target wasn't powerless. Instead of reacting with anger, the owner began observing. Every notice was saved. Every tow documented. Every rule referenced was cross-checked against the HOA bylaws. Patterns emerged quickly. The rules cited weren't being enforced evenly. Other cars violated the same standards without consequence. Board members parked however they liked. Friends of the president received warnings instead of fines. This wasn't about parking. It was about control. The owner realized something important during those early weeks of harassment. Systems that rely on fear only function as long as no one looks too closely. And once someone starts paying attention, the cracks become impossible to ignore. The tow trucks kept coming. And with every tow, the owner stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like an investigator. The setup was complete. The HOA believed it had absolute authority. It didn't yet realize it had chosen the wrong person to test it. The towing didn't just take the car. It took something less visible but far more damaging, a sense of stability. What had once been a simple routine now felt fragile, as if one misstep could trigger another punishment. Every return home carried tension. Every parking decision required calculation. The neighborhood that once felt orderly now felt hostile. The financial impact grew quietly at first. Towing fees arrived unpredictably, disrupting budgets and forcing difficult adjustments. Savings that had been meant for emergencies were redirected toward reclaiming something that should never have been taken in the first place. Each payment felt like surrender, not to a rule, but to a person abusing authority. Time became another cost. Hours lost retrieving the car. Mornings delayed. Commitments reshuffled. What seemed like a minor inconvenience on paper compounded into daily stress. The owner began waking earlier, planning routes around the possibility of another tow, anticipating disruption before it happened. Emotionally, the toll was heavier. The constant enforcement created a feeling of being watched, judged, and evaluated. Even inside the home, there was no true sense of privacy. Curtains stayed closed longer. Outdoor movements became deliberate and cautious. The joy of ownership faded, replaced by vigilance. This was the unspoken power of selective enforcement. It didn't need to be constant. It only needed to be unpredictable. The HOA president understood this instinctively. By changing the reasons for each violation, she kept the owner off balance. One day the car was too close to the curb. The next it was too far. The rules were flexible when applied and rigid when challenged. Meanwhile, the rest of life didn't pause. Work responsibilities continued, unaffected by HOA notices. Deadlines didn't care about towing schedules. Personal obligations didn't accommodate sudden fees or delays. The pressure mounted as the owner struggled to maintain normalcy under abnormal conditions. What made it worse was the isolation. Neighbors noticed what was happening, but no one intervened. Some offered sympathetic looks. Others quietly adjusted their own behavior to avoid attention. The HOA president's reputation discouraged solidarity. No one wanted to be her next project. That silence was intentional. Fear thrived in the absence of resistance. The owner began attending HOA meetings more regularly, sitting quietly, observing the process. The meetings were brief and controlled. Topics were rushed. Questions were deflected. Votes were framed as formalities rather than decisions. The president dominated the space without needing to speak much. Her presence alone set the tone. Board members deferred to her judgment. Residents hesitated before raising concerns. The structure gave the illusion of democracy while operating more like a hierarchy. Behind the scenes, the owner began reading the HOA bylaws carefully. The documents were dense and poorly organized, likely by design. But buried within them were important details. Rules that required warnings before enforcement. Clauses that limited towing authority. Provisions that demanded consistency. None of them were being followed. The realization was unsettling. This wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate disregard. The owner expanded their research beyond HOA documents. County records, public filings, and financial disclosures revealed a pattern of mismanagement. Fines were listed inconsistently. Maintenance expenses appeared inflated. Vendors shared connections that weren't disclosed. Nothing stood out enough to trigger immediate action on its own. But together, the pieces formed a picture of an HOA that functioned without accountability. The parking issue was just the surface. At the same time, the owner's personal resilience was being tested. Anger came in waves, followed by exhaustion. The temptation to confront the HOA president directly was strong, but instinct held it back. Confrontation would only feed the power imbalance. Instead, patience became strategy. Each tow was documented meticulously. Photos, timestamps, maps, and measurements were stored and organized. The owner treated the situation like a case study rather than a personal attack, distancing emotionally while staying engaged mentally. That shift changed everything. Rather than feeling helpless, the owner began feeling informed. Small observations accumulated. The towing company used by the HOA appeared almost exclusively for certain homes. The president's own driveway was frequently occupied by vehicles that violated the same rules others were fined for. Her property featured modifications that lacked visible approval notices. Selective enforcement was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. One detail, in particular, lingered in the owner's mind. Despite her authority, the HOA president rarely spoke about her own property during meetings. Financial discussions were vague. Assessments were justified but never itemized. Transparency existed only when it was convenient. Curiosity turned into investigation. Public property records were accessible with minimal effort. Tax payment histories, liens, and notices were all available for those who looked. The owner didn't expect to find anything significant at first. But then something appeared. The HOA president's property showed irregularities. Delayed payments. Accrued penalties. Notices sent without response. It was subtle but persistent. The contrast was striking. Here was someone aggressively enforcing fines and penalties on others while neglecting obligations tied to her own home. The same rules she claimed upheld the neighborhood didn't seem to apply when they inconvenienced her. The owner didn't act on this information immediately. Instead, it was added to the growing archive of facts. Evidence didn't need urgency. It needed accuracy. As the towing continued, the owner adjusted tactics. The car was parked differently each time, within different interpretations of the rules. Each variation tested the limits of enforcement. Each result was recorded. No matter what changed, the outcome stayed the same. Another tow. Another fine. Another reminder that logic no longer mattered. What began as frustration evolved into clarity. The HOA president wasn't enforcing rules. She was asserting dominance. And dominance depended on the belief that she was untouchable. The owner now understood the real struggle beneath the surface. This wasn't a fight about parking or money. It was about power, and power always leaves a trail. The trail was growing longer. And the owner was following it carefully, knowing that the moment would come when patience would matter more than anger. That moment wasn't here yet. But it was getting closer. By this point, the towing itself had almost become routine. The surprise was gone, replaced by a dull expectation that the car might disappear at any moment. What lingered instead was something heavier and harder to shake, the constant emotional strain of living under someone else's arbitrary authority. The neighborhood no longer felt neutral. Every familiar detail carried new meaning. The curb was no longer just a strip of concrete. It was a boundary line where power was exercised. The HOA signs, once ignored, now felt like warnings. Even the silence between houses seemed charged, as if the community itself was holding its breath. The owner noticed how vigilance had crept into daily life. Decisions that once required no thought now demanded planning. Parking became a calculation. Schedules were built with contingency in mind. Even rest felt conditional, as though peace could be revoked without notice. What made the situation emotionally complex wasn't just the harassment. It was the internal conflict it created. There was anger, sharp and immediate, triggered every time another fine appeared. There was resentment, quieter but persistent, fueled by the unfairness of selective enforcement. But layered beneath both was something more unsettling, doubt. Not doubt about being right, but doubt about whether pushing back was worth the cost. The HOA president had built her authority on exhaustion. She didn't need to defeat people outright. She only needed to wear them down until compliance felt easier than resistance. Every fine was designed not just to punish, but to discourage future defiance. The owner felt that pressure acutely. Some nights were restless. Thoughts looped endlessly, replaying events, imagining alternate outcomes, questioning whether a different response early on might have prevented escalation. Other nights were marked by silence, the kind that comes when frustration gives way to numbness. Still, something kept the owner from backing down completely. It wasn't pride or stubbornness. It was a quiet sense that allowing this behavior to continue unchecked would mean accepting it as normal. And once something like this becomes normal, it spreads. The emotional bridge formed slowly, connecting private frustration to a broader awareness. The owner began to see their situation not as an isolated conflict, but as part of a pattern that affected others too. Small signs appeared. A neighbor across the street stopped parking near the curb altogether. Another quietly removed decorative items from their yard after receiving a warning that had no clear justification. Someone else repainted a fence that had never previously been questioned. No one spoke openly, but the changes were visible. Fear doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reshapes behavior quietly, bending routines until people barely recognize the compromises they've made. That realization shifted the owner's mindset. This wasn't just about a car or fines anymore. It was about how authority, when left unchecked, reshapes entire communities. It creates compliance not through fairness, but through intimidation. The HOA president didn't need to know she was being observed. Her behavior alone was enough to reveal the structure of her power. The owner watched how she interacted with others, how enforcement tightened around some homes and loosened around others. Patterns repeated. Certain houses were never cited. Certain vehicles were never towed. The same names appeared on board approvals again and again. The owner began recognizing the informal hierarchy beneath the formal one. Emotionally, the shift was subtle but profound. Anger softened into focus. The owner no longer felt consumed by the injustice. Instead, there was a growing sense of purpose, calm and deliberate. The documentation, the research, the quiet observation all began to feel meaningful, not just reactive. Each tow, while still frustrating, added another layer of evidence. Each notice reinforced the same truth. The HOA president wasn't invincible. She was careless. People who believe they are untouchable often leave the most visible trails. They cut corners. They assume no one is paying attention. They confuse silence with consent. The owner's emotional state stabilized around this understanding. There was still stress, still inconvenience, still moments of doubt. But there was also clarity. A recognition that patience, not confrontation, was the strongest response available. This internal shift bridged the gap between being targeted and becoming strategic. The owner began imagining outcomes not in terms of winning or losing, but in terms of restoring balance. What would it look like for the power dynamic to correct itself? What would accountability actually mean in a place like this? Those questions didn't have immediate answers. But they didn't need to. The process mattered more than the timeline. As the weeks passed, the towing slowed slightly, then resumed, as if testing whether the pressure was still effective. Each time it happened, the emotional impact was less sharp. The owner felt less like a victim and more like an observer watching a predictable pattern unfold. That emotional distance was critical. It allowed decisions to be made without desperation. It prevented impulsive reactions that could undermine long-term plans. It turned frustration into fuel rather than distraction. The emotional bridge completed itself quietly. On one side was the initial shock, anger, and stress. On the other was resolve, patience, and intent. Crossing that bridge didn't erase the hardship, but it reframed it. The owner understood now that the situation would not resolve through appeals or arguments. It would resolve through exposure, through the careful application of the same rules the HOA president wielded so freely. Power didn't disappear on its own. It had to be met with something stronger. And that strength wasn't loud. It was patient. As the owner looked around the neighborhood one evening, watching the familiar houses settle into quiet, there was a strange sense of calm. Nothing had changed on the surface. The HOA president still held her title. The rules were still enforced selectively. The threat still existed. But internally, everything had shifted. The owner was no longer reacting. They were waiting. And waiting, when done with intention, can be the most powerful move of all. The shift from quiet observation to visible consequence did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually, like pressure building beneath a sealed surface. For weeks, the owner continued living carefully, parking cautiously, documenting relentlessly, and attending HOA meetings without drawing attention. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. The HOA president, however, sensed a change long before she could identify it. The usual responses were gone. There were no appeals filed, no frustrated emails sent, no visible pushback. The silence unsettled her. She was accustomed to resistance, even enjoyed it, because resistance validated her authority. Silence offered no such confirmation. In response, enforcement intensified. Not just for the owner, but for others too. Warnings multiplied across the neighborhood. Lawn violations, trash bin placement, holiday decorations left out too long. The rules were suddenly omnipresent, enforced with a frequency that bordered on obsession. The HOA president's influence spread outward, creating an atmosphere of collective tension. Residents noticed. The neighborhood's tone shifted. Casual conversations shortened. People checked over their shoulders before speaking about HOA matters. Attendance at meetings increased, not out of engagement, but concern. People wanted to know what was happening, even if they were afraid to ask. The owner watched all of this carefully. The towing resumed with renewed intensity. This time, it was paired with formal notices sent through certified mail, escalating the appearance of seriousness. The justifications remained inconsistent, but the penalties grew harsher. Late fees were added faster. Threats of further action were implied rather than stated. The HOA president believed escalation would force compliance. Instead, it triggered scrutiny. For the first time, residents began comparing notes. Quietly at first, then more openly. They realized violations were not evenly distributed. Some houses were cited repeatedly. Others not at all. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore once acknowledged. The owner didn't initiate these conversations. They didn't need to. The environment itself had become tense enough to provoke curiosity. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was palpable. More residents attended than usual. Fewer left early. The agenda was longer, but discussions were rushed. Financial summaries were vague. When enforcement was mentioned, it was framed as necessary discipline, not selective action. The HOA president maintained her composure, but cracks were forming. Questions were asked, not directly, but carefully. Requests for clarification. Requests for documentation. Requests for consistency. None of them accused. All of them exposed gaps. The owner remained silent, observing how the president deflected, how board members shifted uncomfortably, how the room felt different than before. Authority was still present, but unquestioned control was not. Outside the meetings, the owner's preparations continued. The property records regarding the HOA president's home were updated again. Another notice had been issued. Another deadline missed. The unpaid taxes had grown into a formal problem, one that could no longer be dismissed as an oversight. The auction date was approaching. This knowledge added weight to every interaction, even those that appeared insignificant. Each new tow felt less like an attack and more like a countdown. Each fine felt less intimidating and more ironic. The HOA president, unaware of the impending shift, grew more aggressive. She expanded enforcement beyond parking. Exterior compliance notices appeared at the owner's property, citing minor issues that had existed for years without complaint. The strategy was clear: overwhelm, exhaust, dominate. But the owner was no longer operating from a place of fear. The emotional distance established earlier held firm. Each notice was simply another document added to the archive. Each escalation reinforced the same conclusion. This was not governance. This was personal. The public challenge came unexpectedly, not through confrontation, but through visibility. A resident submitted a formal request for HOA financial transparency, citing inconsistencies and referencing state regulations. The request followed proper procedure, leaving the board legally obligated to respond. That request changed everything. The HOA president could not ignore it. She could not dismiss it without consequence. For the first time, her authority faced a structure larger than the HOA itself. The board scrambled. Emergency discussions were held behind closed doors. Lawyers were consulted. Documents were reviewed hastily. Errors that had been buried under routine suddenly mattered. The owner watched from a distance as tension rippled outward. Notices stopped temporarily. Enforcement slowed. The towing company ceased appearing overnight. It was subtle, but noticeable. The HOA president's attention had shifted. She was no longer focused on punishment. She was focused on defense. At the same time, the county auction listing went live publicly. Anyone who searched would now see the HOA president's address listed among delinquent properties. The information was no longer obscure. It was accessible, visible, and undeniable. The owner prepared quietly. Funds were secured. Legal advice reaffirmed the process. No shortcuts were taken. No assumptions were made. Everything followed the law precisely. As the auction date approached, the HOA president's behavior changed again. Her presence in the neighborhood became erratic. Meetings were rescheduled. Communications were delayed. The confident authority that once defined her began to fray. Residents noticed that too. Whispers spread, though no one had the full picture. Something was happening. The system that had once felt immovable now felt unstable. The owner did not reveal their intentions. They understood that the most effective public challenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was structural. It was letting the same systems the HOA president relied on apply to her without exception. The rising tension reached its peak not with confrontation, but with anticipation. The neighborhood held its breath. The HOA president, still unaware of the precise nature of the threat, felt pressure closing in from all sides. Authority that once flowed effortlessly now required constant maintenance. Every decision felt heavier. Every action risked exposure. The owner, by contrast, felt calm. They had crossed the point of no return. Not emotionally, but strategically. The situation had evolved beyond personal grievance into a matter of consequence. The public challenge was underway, even if no one had named it yet. Soon, the imbalance would correct itself. And when it did, it wouldn't arrive with anger or spectacle. It would arrive with paperwork. With deadlines. With finality. The rules were about to apply equally. And for the first time, the HOA president would not be the one enforcing them. Life in the neighborhood had grown tense, almost unrecognizable. The familiar rhythm of quiet mornings and peaceful afternoons had been replaced by cautious glances, whispered conversations, and a pervasive sense of anticipation. Residents moved differently now. Even the simplest actions, placing a newspaper on a doorstep, walking a dog, or retrieving the mail, carried an undercurrent of fear. The HOA president had not yet been confronted directly, but her authority was faltering. Small cracks that had always existed were widening, visible to anyone paying attention. For the owner, the stress that had once felt consuming had transformed into focus. Each action, each document, each observation had a purpose. The towing, the fines, the arbitrary enforcement, all of it had been catalogued, analyzed, and organized into a coherent narrative. The owner's patience had become a tool, one that could be applied strategically. Emotional energy no longer dictated reaction, logic and preparation guided every move. It was during a routine check of public property records that the revelation appeared. The listing, almost hidden among hundreds of county files, stood out because it seemed impossible. The HOA president's own home, the one she used to enforce rules with unquestioned authority, had unpaid property taxes stretching back several years. Multiple notices had been sent, penalties accrued, and deadlines ignored. The amounts were substantial, and the accumulation of years of inattention or negligence had created an opening that was impossible to miss. The implications were immediate and profound. The same system she wielded with precision against others, a system of enforcement, documentation, and legal consequence, was now poised to apply to her. The county had scheduled the property for a tax lien auction. If she failed to pay or redeem the taxes, the home she had once controlled and displayed with such pride could legally change hands. The owner reviewed the records in detail. Notices of delinquency, interest penalties, deadlines for payment, everything aligned with state law. The property was not a speculative listing, not a clerical error. The vulnerability was real, tangible, and enforceable. Months of harassment, intimidation, and petty fines had prepared the owner for this moment without them even realizing it. At the same time, the HOA president's outward behavior revealed her unawareness. She continued her rounds with the same rigid confidence, issuing citations, lecturing homeowners, and maintaining the illusion of unchallenged authority. There were no signs she knew the precarious position of her own property. She believed, as always, that her control was absolute. That belief, the very trait that had made her so effective at harassment, was now the same trait that ensured her downfall. The tension began to rise quietly, almost imperceptibly, among the other residents. Attendance at HOA meetings increased. Questions became more frequent. Requests for records were formalized. People noticed the inconsistencies in enforcement and began connecting dots that had long been ignored. The board, previously obedient to the president's will, now showed subtle hesitation. The first cracks in her perceived omnipotence became visible. The owner, however, did not act impulsively. There was no immediate confrontation. No announcement. No dramatic declaration. That was not the path to resolution. Instead, a careful strategy emerged, patience combined with preparation. The auction date was months away, providing a narrow but critical window. Any misstep by the HOA president, any continued disregard for deadlines, would serve to strengthen the owner's position. Meanwhile, the repeated towing incidents and fines, which had once been emotionally draining, now seemed almost ironic. Each arbitrary action by the HOA president became part of the narrative of her own vulnerability. Every fine she issued, every citation she handed down, every intimidation tactic used was part of a pattern that could be contrasted with the legal exposure of her own property. The imbalance was no longer abstract. It was concrete, and it had been revealed by nothing more than diligence and attention to detail. The revelation carried a psychological weight that extended beyond strategy. The owner began to understand the depth of selective enforcement and its consequences. Fear, once used as a weapon, had been transformed into a lens for observation. The HOA president, confident in her own invulnerability, had ignored warnings and neglected responsibilities that were now visible to anyone who looked carefully. The very system she had manipulated to dominate others had created a mirror in which her own failures reflected with clarity. As days passed, the tension continued to build. The HOA president remained unaware of the owner's knowledge, yet subtle signs of stress began to show in her behavior. She became more rigid, more erratic. Meetings were postponed or shortened. Decisions, once casual, now carried visible deliberation. The community could feel the shift, though no one fully understood the reason. Authority, once absolute, had become fragile. The owner watched quietly as leverage accumulated. The property records, the auction notices, the unpaid taxes, all of it provided undeniable leverage. Unlike the fines and towing, which were easily dismissed through emotion and compliance, this was legal, enforceable, and final. The power dynamic had reversed without the HOA president realizing it. She remained aggressive outwardly, but the ground beneath her authority was eroding. The final piece of the revelation was the realization that this shift would not require confrontation to be effective. Legal systems, deadlines, and processes would enforce consequences without emotion, without spectacle, and without bias. The tools of governance she had used to intimidate others would now act against her. The owner's patience and diligence had turned her own tactics into instruments of accountability. By the time the auction notices became official, the neighborhood had begun to notice subtle changes in behavior. Board members were quieter, homeowners were cautiously optimistic, and tension hovered in the air like static electricity. The HOA president, still blind to her vulnerability, continued as before, unaware that her position was no longer protected by fear or authority. The revelation had transformed the narrative entirely. What had started as harassment and arbitrary punishment now existed in a new context, one where the balance of power had shifted. The HOA president, who had believed herself untouchable, was now vulnerable to the very system she had used to dominate others. And the owner, who had once felt powerless, now possessed a quiet, undeniable advantage. Knowledge, preparation, and patience had created an opening for justice without confrontation. The emotional weight of past harassment had been converted into clarity and strategy. The final realization settled firmly: victory would not come from anger or revenge. It would come from letting the system act as it was designed to, combined with meticulous preparation and timing. The HOA president had built her power on the illusion of invulnerability. That illusion had been shattered by public records, by legal deadlines, and by quiet observation. The tension reached its peak, poised on the precipice of consequence. The revelation was complete, and the stage was set. The HOA president's downfall was no longer a matter of speculation, it was inevitable, provided the owner maintained patience and precision. What had begun as a struggle over a simple parking violation had transformed into a broader battle over fairness, accountability, and the consequences of unchecked authority. The neighborhood itself had become a silent witness, caught between fear of enforcement and the anticipation of change. The owner, having bridged emotion with strategy, waited. The next chapter would not be defined by preparation or observation, it would be defined by action. And that action was coming, quietly, inexorably, and decisively. The day arrived quietly, without fanfare or public spectacle. The auction for the HOA president's property opened online, accessible to anyone who had been following the public notices. The house she had once used to project authority, to intimidate neighbors, to enforce rules with an iron hand, now appeared as a vulnerable asset exposed to the impartial processes of law. The irony was unmistakable. The very systems she had manipulated for personal control were poised to claim her home. The owner, who had been preparing for this moment with meticulous care, monitored the proceedings carefully. Every bid, every verification, every procedural step was accounted for. There was no haste, no drama, no impulsive maneuver. Months of observation, documentation, and strategic patience culminated here. The power that had once been wielded over them could now be redirected in the most lawful and precise manner possible. As the auction progressed, it became clear that there would be minimal competition. Investors and opportunists were either unaware of the property or uninterested in its legal encumbrances. The opening bid was low, significantly below market value, but perfectly sufficient to establish leverage. When the owner's bid was placed, it was done calmly, confidently, with the assurance that every step had been legally verified. The auction ended, and the property officially changed hands. Ownership had transferred in strict accordance with county law. The HOA president, who had never anticipated such an outcome, had no immediate recourse. Her authority, once absolute within the neighborhood, had no power here. The laws she had enforced on others now applied to her without exception. The effect on the neighborhood was palpable. Residents, who had long lived under fear of selective enforcement, watched as the balance of power shifted invisibly but definitively. The invisible walls of intimidation that had once constrained their actions were suddenly weakened. The HOA board itself, which had often deferred to the president's will, began to reconsider its practices. Transparency became more than a suggestion, it became a necessity. For the first time, the mechanisms of governance were applied uniformly, not arbitrarily. The former HOA president moved out of her home quietly, without public confrontation or dramatic declaration. There was no revenge spectacle, no celebratory announcement, no vindictive display. Her removal was procedural, legal, and unavoidable. Yet its impact resonated across the neighborhood. The tension that had gripped residents for months began to ease, and the subtle fear that had governed daily life slowly began to fade. For the owner, the resolution was profound in ways that extended beyond the acquisition of property. It was a vindication of patience, diligence, and strategic thinking. It was evidence that meticulous attention to detail, combined with adherence to law and procedure, could overcome harassment and abuse of power. The victory was not born of impulsive retaliation or emotional confrontation, it was born of preparation and clarity of purpose. The moral weight of the situation became increasingly clear. The HOA president had relied on fear to maintain control. She had assumed that compliance could be demanded through intimidation and arbitrary enforcement. Yet systems built to serve fairness are ultimately impartial, even when human behavior bends them temporarily. Abuse of power, no matter how absolute it seems in the moment, carries consequences that can emerge in unexpected ways. The neighborhood itself began to heal. Rules continued to exist, but enforcement became more consistent. Fines were applied uniformly. Notices were issued according to procedure, and transparency became the standard rather than an exception. Residents felt safer, more confident, and more empowered to participate in governance. Fear no longer dictated their daily choices. The car, once towed repeatedly, now rested securely without threat of arbitrary action. The owner reflected on the journey from harassment to resolution. The initial towing, which had seemed disproportionate and personal, was merely a symptom of a much larger issue. It revealed not only the selective enforcement of power but also the vulnerabilities that accompany overconfidence and neglect. The transformation from victim to strategist was gradual, requiring both emotional endurance and disciplined observation. The moral implications extended beyond the individual conflict. The story demonstrated the importance of accountability, both personal and systemic. Authority, when unchallenged, can become destructive. Vigilance, when applied patiently and strategically, can restore balance. Harassment, intimidation, and selective enforcement may dominate temporarily, but they are ultimately constrained by law, fairness, and diligence. The resolution also highlighted the power of patience as a tool for justice. Immediate confrontation, emotional reaction, or impulsive retaliation might have satisfied temporary anger but would not have produced lasting results. By maintaining calm, documenting thoroughly, and following legal procedures, the owner ensured that the consequences were undeniable and permanent. In the aftermath, the HOA president became a cautionary example. Her downfall was not publicized through gossip or spectacle, yet the knowledge spread quietly through the community. Residents began to engage more critically with governance. Questions were asked, rules were examined, and procedures were scrutinized. Authority became accountable, not absolute. The final outcome, while satisfying in its strategic precision, also carried a personal dimension of peace. The owner no longer needed to live under the stress of constant surveillance, fines, and towing. The balance of power, once distorted, had been restored through law, patience, and observation. The car remained parked, the home remained secure, and the neighborhood slowly returned to the rhythm of ordinary life. This resolution underscored a universal truth: those who wield authority must be accountable, and systems designed to enforce fairness are resilient when approached with diligence. Abuse may succeed temporarily, but transparency, patience, and strategy reveal vulnerabilities that can correct imbalance permanently. The neighborhood, once governed by fear, now operated with clarity. Residents had witnessed a transformation that required no spectacle, only the quiet application of principle. The owner's journey, beginning with a single towing incident and culminating in the lawful acquisition of leverage, became a silent lesson in resilience, strategy, and the importance of understanding systems before attempting to challenge them. Ultimately, the story was more than a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of preparation, observation, and adherence to fairness. Harassment and intimidation could be countered without malice, spectacle, or impulsive action. Legal structures, when respected and utilized, could restore balance. Emotional endurance, combined with strategic action, produced results that neither anger nor immediate confrontation could achieve. And so, the neighborhood returned to its ordinary rhythm, transformed not by conflict, but by accountability. The HOA president had lost her unilateral power. Residents regained their sense of security. The owner, once targeted, now rested in quiet confidence, knowing that patience, preparation, and adherence to principle could correct injustice without compromise. The moral of the story endured: true power is not held through fear. It is established through fairness, accountability, and respect for the systems that bind communities together. Those who exploit authority may dominate briefly, but diligence, patience, and lawfulness ensure that balance is ultimately restored.